All right, so next in our video series here on the considerations of fraud as it relates to a financial statement audit, we're going to be discussing our understanding of how those charged with governance view fraud and respond to risk of material misstatement due to fraud. And so in the last video, we talked about having discussions with members of management or others within the entity. But for this video, we'll be talking about having discussions or understanding of those charged with governance. So maybe the board of directors or the audit committee. And this is in AUC section 240.20 and 21. And it says that unless all those charged with governance are involved in managing the entity, the auditor should attain an understanding of how those charged with governance exercise their oversight of management's processes for identifying and responding to the risk of fraud in the entity, and the internal control that management has established to mitigate these risks. So the entity under audit may not have a board of directors or an equivalent group. And so in that case, the discussions we had with management, as we discussed in the prior video, would suffice for these purposes, because those of management, or maybe the owner operator of the company, is technically the one who is charged with governance also. So if there's no group of people who are charged with governance, then we don't have to comply with this particular requirement. But if they do have a board of directors, then we need to understand how they oversee management and respond to the risk of fraud in the entity and the various internal controls that hope to accomplish that. And in order to do that, we need to make inquiries of those charged with governance or on the audit committee, or at least the chair of the audit committee, and ask them a few questions to get their views about the risk of fraud and if they know about any actual suspected or alleged fraud affecting the entity. And the reason we do this is in large part to corroborate the responses that we received in management from the prior discussions that we had. So we see here that here in AUC section 240, we have a lot of responsibilities as it relates to fraud and inquiring with several people within the entity, as we saw in the prior video, as well as people who are on the governance side of the entity. So we've got some explanatory material here, so let's go down to those sections and see some more details about how we need to accomplish this. Okay, so now we're down in the explanatory material as it relates to obtaining an understanding of the oversight exercised by those charged with governance. And so typically those charged with governance, for instance, the board of directors, are responsible for overseeing the entity's systems for monitoring risk, financial control, and compliance with the law. And depending on the type of entity, these responsibilities may be more of a hands-on requirement of the board, or more of a high-level involvement. And so that's why we need to understand in our discussions with them and through other sources of information how involved they are with the entity and their responsibilities as it pertains to the entity's assessment of the risk of fraud and of relevant internal control. And so getting that understanding of their oversight might give us some insights into the susceptibility of the entity to management fraud and the adequacy of internal control over risk of fraud and the competency and integrity of management. So as we saw in the prior video, one of our biggest risks is management fraud. So if we gain an understanding of how those charged with governance manage that, then we get an insight into how adequate the controls are around that risk. And also, in order to gain that understanding, we can do it in a number of ways. We could attend their board of directors meetings and listen in. We could read the minutes from the meetings, or we can make inquiries of those charged with governance. So select someone from the board and hold a formal discussion with them regarding these ideas. And so as we mentioned before, and typically with less complex entities, there may not be a board of directors. And so those charged with governance are basically management or the owner-operator. And so in that case, we don't need to perform any of this because we've already held these discussions with those members of management. And also there's no oversight of management, so it would be kind of a moot point, because the main goal was to understand management's fraud risk